The thunderous boom of an approaching storm wasn't what woke Preston Hayes from his fitful sleep, but the desperate pounding at his cabin door that sliced through the howling Montana wind like a knife. He bolted upright, his calloused hand instinctively reaching for the Colt revolver he kept beside his bed. In 8 years of solitude on this remote stretch of land, no visitor had ever arrived after sundown, especially not during a spring tempest that threatened to tear the sky apart. It was 1878, and civilization remained a day's ride away from Preston's modest homestead. He'd chosen this isolation deliberately after returning from the war between the states with memories he'd rather forget and a heart he'd sealed shut tighter than a banker's vault. The pounding came again, more urgent this time. Preston pulled on his trousers and grabbed an oil lamp, his movements quick despite the perpetual ache in his left shoulder, a souvenir from Antietam that served as a daily reminder of his past. "Coming," he called gruffly, moving through the cabin's main room. The sparse furnishings, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and bookshelves lined with worn classics, were illuminated by the lamp's flickering glow. Preston undid the heavy wooden bar across the door and pulled it open, the wind immediately attempting to wrestle it from his grip. What he saw made him freeze, the cold air rushing around him forgotten. A woman stood before him, drenched and trembling, clutching a small bundle to her chest. Her dark hair was plastered to her pale face, and her eyes held a wild desperation that struck something deep within him. But it was the bundle in her arms that drew his gaze, a small, whimpering infant wrapped in a sodden blanket. "Please," she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the storm. "Help us." Preston hesitated only a moment before stepping aside. "Get in here, madam, before you both catch your death." The woman stumbled across the threshold, nearly collapsing as she entered the warmth of his cabin. Preston quickly closed the door against the tempest and turned to find her swaying on her feet. "Sit," he commanded, pulling out one of the wooden chairs. "Let me stoke the fire." She sank down gratefully, still clutching the baby to her chest. The infant's cries grew stronger as feeling returned to its tiny body. Preston built up the fire in the stove until flames crackled reassuringly, then filled his coffee pot with water and set it to boil. When he turned back to his unexpected visitors, the woman was unwrapping the wet blanket from around the baby with shaking hands. "I'm Frances," she said, her voice steadier now. "Frances Miller. This is my daughter, Charlotte." "Preston Hayes," he replied, suddenly aware of his state of undressed, shirtless with his suspenders hanging at his sides. He quickly pulled a clean shirt from a hook by the door and shrugged it on. "Where did you come from, Mrs. Miller? There's nothing for miles around." Frances looked up, her eyes revealing a flash of wariness. "It's Mississippi. And we came from a long way. Our wagon broke an axle about 2 miles back. I saw your chimney smoke earlier today and remembered the direction." She glanced down at the baby, now revealed as a girl with wisps of dark hair like her mother's. "I didn't know what else to do when the storm hit." Preston nodded, not pressing further despite the questions swirling in his mind. A young, unmarried woman with a baby, traveling alone through Montana territory was unusual, to say the least. But he recognized the look of someone running from something or someone. He'd worn that same expression himself once. "You're both soaked through," he said, turning to a trunk at the foot of his bed. He pulled out a clean flannel shirt and a blanket. "It's not much, but you can change into this. I'll turn my back." Frances hesitated, then nodded gratefully. "Would you mind holding Charlotte? Just for a moment?" Before Preston could object, she was standing, extending the infant toward him. He hadn't held a baby since his sister's children, years before the war. He took the child awkwardly, surprised by how light she felt in his arms. The baby blinked up at him with dark eyes, her tiny face scrunched in confusion at this stranger. Preston found himself smiling despite his discomfort. "Hello there, little one," he said softly, bouncing her gently as he'd seen his sister do. To his surprise, the baby's cries subsided to hiccuping whimpers. "She likes you," Francis said, slipping his flannel shirt over her head. It hung to her knees, but at least it was dry. "She doesn't usually take to strangers." Preston felt a strange warmth in his chest at her words, quickly tamped down by caution. "The coffee will be ready soon. I've got some beans and salt pork I can heat up if you're hungry." "That would be wonderful," Francis replied, taking the baby back and wrapping her in the dry blanket. "We haven't eaten since morning." As Preston busied himself with the simple meal, he kept stealing glances at the woman and child. Frances couldn't have been more than 25, with delicate features and dark hair that curled as it dried. Despite her obvious exhaustion, there was a determined set to her jaw that spoke of strength. "Where are you headed?" he asked as he placed a steaming plate before her. Frances hesitated, bouncing the now quiet baby in one arm while she picked up the fork with her free hand.
"West.
California. Maybe. Somewhere I can start fresh." Preston nodded, not asking the obvious question of what she was starting fresh from. Everyone had their secrets, especially out here, where many came to escape their pasts. "The storm's likely to last through the night," he said instead. "You can take my bed. I'll sleep by the fire." "I couldn't, it's no trouble," he interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "You and the little one need proper rest. Tomorrow I'll ride out and see about your wagon." Frances looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine his motives. Whatever she saw in his weathered face must have reassured her, because she eventually nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes." "Preston," he corrected, surprising himself. "Preston," she repeated, a small smile touching her lips for the first time. "Thank you." Later, as Preston laid out his bedroll near the stove, he listened to the steady breathing of Frances and her baby in his bed. The storm raged outside, but inside his cabin, something had changed. The space that had felt empty for so long now felt different, alive somehow. Sleep was long in coming as Preston stared at the ceiling, wondering what tomorrow would bring and why, for the first time in years, he was looking forward to finding out. When morning broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed clean sky and mud-soaked earth. Preston woke before dawn, as was his habit, and quietly prepared coffee, trying not to disturb his guests. Frances stirred anyway, sitting up with her hair tousled from sleep. Charlotte was nestled against her, tiny hands curled into fists. For a moment, Preston was struck by how they transformed a Spartan bedroom, bringing life to a space that had been merely functional for so long. "Good morning," Frances said softly, careful not to wake the baby. "I hope we didn't keep you from sleeping well." Preston shook his head. "Been sleeping on harder ground than this floor for years." He poured a cup of coffee and brought it to her. "How's the little one?" "Better," Frances replied, accepting the cup gratefully. "She's resilient." There was pride in her voice, and something else, fear, perhaps, or worry. "If you're feeling up to it, I thought I'd ride out after breakfast to check on your wagon," Preston said. "See if it can be fixed, or if we need to bring your belongings back here." Frances bit her lip, clearly conflicted. "I don't want to be more trouble than we already have been." "No trouble," Preston assured her, surprised to find he meant it. "Not much else to do out here anyway." After a breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with the last of Preston's molasses, he saddled his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Samson. Frances provided directions to where she'd left the wagon, and Preston set out, riding through the mud-slicked landscape. He found the wagon easily enough, a small covered affair with one axle indeed broken clean through. Preston dismounted and examined the damage, noting with concern that it wasn't just the axle that was problematic. The wagon had been ransacked, its contents strewn about the muddy ground. Someone had been here after Frances left. Preston searched the area, finding boot prints that hadn't been washed away by the rain. At least 2 men, he reckoned, and they'd headed east away from his cabin, thankfully. He gathered what belongings he could salvage: a carpet bag with women's clothing, a small wooden box with a few pieces of jewelry, and a child's blanket that had been trampled into the mud. The wagon itself would require a new axle and significant repairs before it could be moved. When Preston returned to the cabin, Francis was sitting outside on his porch swing, nursing Charlotte beneath a light blanket for modesty. She looked up as he approached, her expression brightening, then falling as she saw the meager possessions he'd recovered. "Someone got to it after you left," Preston explained, dismounting and tying Samson to the hitching post. "Took what they wanted and scattered the rest." Frances closed her eyes briefly, a flash of despair crossing her features before she composed herself. "Was it? Did you see any sign of who might have done it?" There was fear in her question, and Preston studied her more carefully. "Just boot prints. 2 men headed east. Friends of yours?" "No," she said quickly. "Not friends." She adjusted Charlotte and refastened her borrowed shirt. "The wagon? Axles broken clean through. It would take a proper wheelwright to fix it, and the nearest one's in Liberty Falls, 2 days' ride from here." Frances nodded slowly, looking out at the vast, empty landscape surrounding the cabin. "I see." Preston carried the salvage items inside and returned to find Frances still staring into the distance, her expression troubled. "Miss Miller," he began, then corrected himself. "Frances. I don't mean to pry, but it seems to me you might be in some kind of trouble." "If there's someone after you, I don't want to involve you in my problems, Mr. Hayes," she interrupted, standing with Charlotte cradled against her shoulder. "You've been kind enough already. Perhaps if you could direct me to Liberty Falls, I could find work there and save for repairs." Preston frowned. "That's a hard journey on foot, especially with a baby. And if those men are looking for you." The slight widening of her eyes confirmed his suspicion. Whoever had ransacked the wagon wasn't just an opportunistic thief. "Stay here," he found himself saying. "At least until I can arrange transportation to town. It's safer than striking out on your own." Frances hesitated, clearly torn between pride and pragmatism. Finally, she nodded. "Only for a few days, until I can figure something out." "Of course," Preston agreed, ignoring the strange relief he felt at her acceptance. "In the meantime, let me show you around the place. It's not much, but it's home." Over the next few days, Preston and Frances fell into an unexpectedly comfortable routine. Preston tended to his small herd of cattle and the vegetable garden behind the cabin, while Frances kept house and cared for Charlotte. They worked together preparing meals, Frances proving herself adept at turning Preston's simple provisions into surprisingly tasty fare. In the evenings, they sat on the porch if weather permitted, or by the fire if it didn't, talking about everything and nothing. Preston found himself sharing stories he hadn't told in years about his childhood in Pennsylvania, his time as a Union soldier, the sister he'd lost to influenza during the war. Frances was more guarded about her past, but spoke warmly of her childhood in St. Louis, her love of books, and her dreams of seeing the Pacific Ocean someday. She never mentioned Charlotte's father, and Preston never asked, though curiosity gnawed at him. On the 4th night, as they sat by the fire with Charlotte sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle Preston had constructed from an old crate, Frances finally broached the subject herself. "You must wonder about Charlotte's father," she said quietly, her fingers working at a piece of mending. Preston looked up from the bridle he was repairing. "It's not my business to ask." "No, but you've opened your home to us without question. You deserve some explanation." Frances set aside her sewing and took a deep breath. "I was engaged to a man named William Blackwood. He seemed respectable, came from a good family, had prospects in his father's banking business. But after we were intimate, I discovered he was not the man he pretended to be." Preston kept his expression neutral, though anger stirred at the implication. "How so?" "He had gambling debts. Substantial ones. When I told him I was with child, he saw an opportunity. His family is wealthy, you see. He thought if he married me and presented them with a grandchild, they would pay his debts. But you didn't marry him, Preston observed. Frances shook her head. The night before our wedding, I overheard him speaking with another man discussing how once we were married, I would be dealt with after the child was born. An unfortunate accident, they called it. Her voice trembled slightly. William would inherit my family's modest estate as my widower and gain his father's forgiveness for presenting a grandchild. Preston's hands stilled on the bridle. He meant to kill you.
Yes. So I ran.
That night, with only what I could carry. Her eyes lifted to meet his. Charlotte was born in a convent in Chicago. The sisters were kind, but I couldn't stay. William has connections, money to hire men to search for me. I've been traveling ever since, taking odd jobs where I can. And you think the men who ransacked your wagon are working for him? Frances nodded. He won't give up. Not until he is Charlotte his heir. Me, he would happily see dead. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and Charlotte's soft breathing. Preston's mind raced, processing this information and what it meant for the woman sitting across from him, a woman who, he realized with some surprise, he had come to admire greatly in just a few days. You're safe here, he said finally, the words coming out more fiercely than he'd intended. For as long as you need. Frances looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. I can't ask that of you, Preston. These men, they're dangerous. I won't put you at risk. I'm not exactly defenseless, Frances, he replied, gesturing to the rifle mounted above the door and the revolver he kept within reach. I fought through Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Gettysburg. I can handle a couple of hired thugs if it comes to that. A small smile touched her lips. You hardly know us. I know enough, Preston said simply.
And he did.
He knew she was brave, resourceful, and fiercely protective of her child. He knew she cooked beans better than he ever could, hummed soft lullabies when she thought he couldn't hear, and had a laugh that made something long dormant inside him stir to life. Thank you, Frances whispered, her eyes bright with unshed tears. For everything. Preston nodded, suddenly uncomfortable with the emotion thick in the air between them. It's getting late. We should turn in. That night, as Preston lay on his bedroll by the dying fire, he thought about Frances's story and what it meant. He'd been alone for so long, content in his solitude, or so he'd thought. Now, with Frances and Charlotte temporarily filling his home with life, he realized how empty it had been before. But they wouldn't stay forever. Couldn't stay forever. Frances had her dreams of California, of a fresh start far from the reach of the man who threatened her. And Preston had.
What?
A small cattle operation, a cabin in the middle of nowhere, and memories he'd rather forget. Yet for the first time in years, he found himself wanting more. The days stretched into a week, and still Preston didn't make the journey to Liberty Falls. There were always reasons to delay. A fence needed mending, a calf required attention, rain threatened. Frances didn't push, settling into life at the cabin with a naturalness that surprised them both. Charlotte thrived under their joint care. At nearly 6 months old, she was starting to show personality, babbling constantly, reaching for objects with determined little hands, and smiling widely whenever Preston entered her field of vision. She's quite taken with you, Frances observed one afternoon as Preston entertained the baby by dangling his pocket watch in front of her while Frances kneaded bread dough. Smart girl, Preston replied with a wink that made Frances blush slightly. Knows who sneaks her extra molasses when her mama isn't looking. Frances laughed, the sound warming Preston more than the spring sunshine streaming through the windows. Is that why she's been so sticky lately? And here I thought it was just the usual baby dampness. Their eyes met across the table, and something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of how domestic, how right this all felt. Preston looked away first, suddenly aware of how easily he could become accustomed to this life, this family that wasn't his. "I should check the north pasture fence," he said abruptly, setting Charlotte on the blanket spread near the fireplace. "Thought I saw a weak spot yesterday." Frances's smile dimmed slightly, but she nodded. "Dinner will be ready at sundown." Preston escaped into the open air, breathing deeply as he walked toward the barn. He was getting in too deep, caring too much. Frances and Charlotte were temporary visitors, not permanent fixtures in his life. He needed to remember that. But as he saddled Samson and rode out to check the fence line, Preston couldn't help imagining what it would be like if they stayed. If the cabin remained filled with Frances's cooking and Charlotte's laughter. If he had someone to come home to each evening, someone who looked at him the way Frances sometimes did when she thought he wasn't noticing. It was a dangerous line of thinking, and Preston tried to push it aside as he dismounted to repair a loose post. He was hammering the final nail when he heard the distant sound of approaching horses. Preston froze, listening intently. 2 riders, maybe 3, coming from the east. In this remote area, visitors were rare and rarely friendly. Instinct told him this wasn't a social call. He remounted quickly and urged Samson into a gallop, taking a shortcut back to the cabin through a stand of pines. As he emerged from the trees, he saw them 2 men on horseback approaching his property from the main trail. Even at this distance, Preston could see they weren't locals. Their clothes were too fine, their horses too well-bred for the hardscrabble ranchers who populated this territory. Preston spurred Samson faster, reaching the cabin minutes before the riders would arrive. He burst through the door, startling Frances, who was setting the table for dinner. "We have company coming," he said tersely, moving to retrieve his rifle from above the door. 2 men from the east. The color drained from Frances's face. William's men. Most likely. Preston checked the rifle's action, ensuring it was loaded. "Take Charlotte and go into the root cellar. There's a trapdoor under the rug in the pantry. Stay there until I come for you." Frances didn't waste time arguing. She scooped up Charlotte and hurried to the pantry, pulling back the small rug to reveal the trapdoor Preston had installed years ago as protection against both weather and potential threats. "Preston," she said, pausing before descending. "Be careful." He nodded once, his expression grim. "Go on now. And Frances, no matter what you hear, stay hidden." As the trapdoor closed behind them, Preston positioned himself by the window, watching as the riders approached. They were close enough now that he could make out their features, one tall and lean with a scar across his cheek, the other shorter but powerfully built. Both wore city clothes that had seen better days, and both carried sidearms. Preston stepped onto the porch as they reached the yard, his rifle held casually but ready. "Afternoon, gentlemen. You're a long way from anywhere." The men reined in their horses, exchanging glances before the scarred one spoke. "Looking for a woman and a baby. Heard they might be in these parts." "Is that so?" Preston kept his tone neutral. "Don't get many travelers through here, let alone women with babies. What's your business with them?" "Family matter," the shorter man said, his hand resting too casually near his holster. "Young lady ran off with her sister's child. Family's mighty worried." The lie was transparent, but Preston just nodded thoughtfully. "That's a shame. But like I said, haven't seen anyone matching that description." The scarred man's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the cabin. "Mind if we take a look around? Just to be sure?" "Actually, I do mind," Preston replied, lifting his rifle slightly. "This is private property, and I don't recall inviting you in." Tension crackled in the air as the men assessed Preston and his unwavering stance. The shorter one shifted in his saddle, clearly considering whether to draw his weapon. "Wouldn't do that if I were you," Preston warned, his voice hardening. "First shot would take you clean out of that saddle, and your friend wouldn't be far behind." "We're just doing a job," the scarred man said, raising his hands slightly in a placating gesture. No need for bloodshed. Mr. Blackwood is offering a substantial reward for information leading to his fiancée and child's safe return. $500. Could be yours if you're being selective about what you've seen. The sum was enormous, more than most men in the territory would see in years. Preston gave a low whistle, as if considering. That's a tempting offer, he said slowly. But I'm afraid I can't help you. Like I said, no women or babies here. Just me and my cattle. The shorter man spat on the ground. I think you're lying, mister. Saw tracks of a small wagon heading this way before the storm hit. Never saw tracks leaving. That's so. Preston's finger moved closer to the trigger. Well, gentlemen, I think we're done here. I suggest you turn those fancy horses around and ride back wherever you came from. Tell Mr. Blackwood he's wasting his money. For a tense moment, Preston thought they might try something foolish. The shorter man's hand twitched toward his gun, but the scarred one gave a subtle shake of his head. We'll be moving on, the scarred man said finally. But this territory ain't that big. If they're here, we'll find them eventually. You do that, Preston replied evenly. Just not on my land. The men turned their horses and rode away, but Preston remained on the porch until they disappeared from sight. Only then did he lower the rifle and exhale slowly, the tension draining from his shoulders. He returned inside and opened the trapdoor to the root cellar. Frances was huddled in the corner, Charlotte clutched tightly to her chest. The baby was remarkably quiet, as if sensing the need for silence. They're gone, Preston said, offering his hand to help Frances up. For now. Frances climbed out, her face pale in the dim light. They found us. They suspected, Preston corrected. They don't know for certain you're here. But they'll be back, or others like them. Frances sank into a chair, her composure finally cracking. I'm so sorry, Preston. I've brought this danger to your doorstep. We should leave, find somewhere else. No, Preston interrupted firmly. Running isn't the answer. Not anymore. What other choice do I have? Frances looked up at him, her eyes reflecting both fear and determination. I won't risk Charlotte's safety. I won't risk yours. Preston sat across from her, his decision already made though he'd only just realized it. There is another option. Stay here, permanently. Let me help protect you both. Frances stared at him, clearly caught off guard by the suggestion. What are you saying? I'm saying. Preston paused, searching for the right words. I'm saying that in the short time you've been here, this cabin has become more of a home than it's been in all the years I've lived in it alone. I'm saying that Charlotte deserves to grow up somewhere safe, with people who care for her. And I'm saying that I care for you both, more than I thought possible. Preston, let me finish, he said gently. I know it hasn't been long. I know there are 1,000 reasons this is crazy. But out here, life doesn't always give you the luxury of time. Sometimes you have to recognize what matters and hold on to it with both hands. Frances was silent, her expression unreadable as she absently stroked Charlotte's head. I'm not proposing marriage, Preston clarified. Not yet, anyway. That would be your decision in your time. I'm just offering a home, protection, and whatever else might develop between us, if you're willing to see where it leads. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft sounds of Charlotte's breathing and the distant cry of a hawk outside. Preston waited, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't since he was a young man facing his first battle. Finally, Frances spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been running for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stay in one place. Then let me remind you, Preston said, reaching across the table to take her hand. Let me show you what it's like to be still, to be safe. Frances looked down at their joined hands, then back up to meet his gaze. And when they come back, William won't give up easily. Then we'll face them together, Preston replied. And if necessary, We'll find a more permanent solution to Mr. Blackwood's interference. The implication hung in the air between them, neither flinching from it. This was the frontier, where justice sometimes required measures that wouldn't be spoken of in polite society back east. "I don't want you to kill for us," Francis said softly. "I pray it won't come to that," Preston assured her. "But I will do whatever is necessary to keep you both safe. That I promise you." Francis's fingers tightened around his, and in that simple gesture, Preston found his answer. She wouldn't say yes, not yet, but she wouldn't run either. For now, that was enough. That night, after Charlotte was asleep, Preston and Francis sat on the porch swing, watching as stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. The earlier tension had faded, replaced by a tentative peace as they both considered the path ahead. "Tell me about your dream," Preston said, breaking the comfortable silence. "The one about California." Francis smiled, leaning back against the swing. "It's silly, really. I just always wanted to see the ocean. My father had a book with illustrations of the Pacific coast, towering cliffs, endless water stretching to the horizon. It seemed like the edge of the world, where no one could find you if you didn't want to be found." "It's beautiful," Preston agreed. "I saw it once after the war. Worked my way west with a cattle drive that ended in San Francisco. Stood on the shore and felt smaller than I ever had before." "You've been there?" Francis turned to him, eyes wide with interest. "What was it like?" Preston described the thundering waves, the cry of seabirds, the salty tang of the air. As he spoke, he watched Francis's face illuminate with wonder and something like longing. "We could go," he said impulsively. "Not right away, but someday. See the ocean together." Francis smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "That would be wonderful. But I don't want you making promises you can't keep." "I don't make promises lightly, Francis," Preston replied seriously. "If I say we'll see the ocean together someday, then we will." She studied him for a long moment, as if seeing him truly for the first time. "You're a good man, Preston Hayes. Better than I had any right to expect when I knocked on your door that night. I'm just a man who recognizes something worth fighting for when he sees it," Preston said simply. The admission hung in the air between them, more revealing than any declaration of feeling might have been. Francis leaned slightly closer, her shoulder touching his as the swing rocked gently in the evening breeze. "Charlotte needs a father," she said softly. "Someone strong, but gentle. Someone who will teach her to be brave, but also kind." "She has you for that," Preston pointed out. "Yes, but—" Francis hesitated. "A girl should have both parents, if possible. I never thought I'd find a man I could trust with her after William. But then you opened your door that night." Preston's heart hammered in his chest as he recognized what she was offering, not just herself, but her child, her future, her trust. It was a gift more precious than anything he'd ever been given. "I would be honored," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "to be whatever Charlotte needs. Whatever you both need." Francis turned to face him fully then, her expression open and vulnerable in the fading light. "And what do you need, Preston?" The question caught him off guard. No one had asked him that in years, perhaps ever. He'd been so focused on survival, on making it through each day, that he'd stopped considering what might make those days worth living. "This," he said finally, gesturing between them. "A reason to come home at night. Someone to build a future with. I didn't know how much I needed that until you arrived." Francis reached up, her fingers lightly touching his weather-roughened cheek. "I'm glad I found your chimney smoke that day." Preston covered her hand with his own, turning his face slightly to press his lips against her palm. The gesture was intimate, a promise without words. Francis's breath caught, and for a moment they remained frozen in that tableau, both aware of the line they were about to cross. Then Preston leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, Francis met him halfway, her lips touching his in a kiss that was gentle at first, then deepening as they both surrendered to feelings that had been building since that stormy night. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he whispered. "Not because you need protection, not because you have nowhere else to go. Stay because you want to." Francis's answer was to kiss him again, and in that moment, Preston knew he would never let her go. The threat of William Blackwood and his hired men remained, hanging over their newfound happiness like a storm cloud on the horizon. Preston took precautions reinforcing the cabin's door and shutters, keeping his weapons loaded and close at hand, teaching Francis to shoot the smaller of his 2 revolvers. But he refused to let fear dictate their lives. As spring warmed into summer, they established routines that felt increasingly natural. Preston worked the ranch with renewed vigor, making improvements he'd long postponed. Francis transformed the cabin with small touches, curtains sewn from flour sacks, wildflowers in tin cans on the table, the feminine influences that made the space truly a home. Charlotte grew stronger daily, mastering the art of sitting up unassisted and regarding her world with serious dark eyes that missed nothing. She had her mother's tenacity and, Preston liked to think, was developing something of his own stubborn streak. In the evenings, they would often sit on a blanket under the vast Montana sky, Charlotte between them, and talk about the future. Cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence, they made plans expanding the garden, adding a room to the cabin, perhaps acquiring some chickens. "We should be married," Preston said one such evening in late June, the statement casual, as if he were commenting on the weather. "Before winter, I mean." Francis looked up from where she was helping Charlotte practice, standing on wobbly legs. "Is that a proposal, Mr. Hayes?" Preston smiled, recognizing the teasing in her tone. "I suppose it is, Miss Miller. Not a very romantic one, I admit." "I don't know," Francis replied thoughtfully. "There's something very romantic about a man who simply states what he wants without artifice." "And what do you want?" Preston asked, suddenly serious. Francis looked around at the land stretching to the mountains in the distance, then back to Preston. "I want this. A home that's ours. A life we build together." She glanced down at Charlotte. "I want her to grow up feeling safe and loved." "That's not what I asked," Preston said gently. "I want to know what you want, Francis. For yourself." Francis was quiet for a moment, considering. "I want to wake up each morning knowing exactly where I am and who I'm with. I want to stop looking over my shoulder. I want—" She met his gaze directly. "I want you, Preston. As my husband, as Charlotte's father, if you'll have us." Preston moved to kneel beside her, taking both her hands in his. "Francis Miller, will you marry me? Make this home truly ours? Let me be a father to Charlotte, and perhaps, someday, to other children we might have together?" Tears welled in Francis's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to all of it." Preston leaned forward to seal the promise with a kiss, but was interrupted by Charlotte's indignant squawk as she toppled onto her bottom between them. They both laughed, the sound carrying across the open land in the golden evening light. "I think she approves," Preston said, scooping up the baby and lifting her high above his head, making her giggle. "Don't you, little one? Want me to be your pa?"
"Pa,"
Charlotte exclaimed, her first clear word beyond the usual baby babbling. Preston froze, staring up at the child in astonishment. Francis gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Did she just, pa?" Charlotte repeated, more insistently this time, reaching pudgy hands toward Preston's face. Preston looked at Francis, seeing his own wonder reflected in her eyes. "I guess that settles it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Can't disappoint my daughter, can I?" The word felt right on his tongue, as natural as breathing. My daughter. The child he hadn't known he needed until she arrived on his doorstep in the middle of a storm. Francis rose to her knees, wrapping her arms around both of them. "Your daughter," she agreed softly. "Your family." They were married 2 weeks later by a circuit-riding preacher who happened through the area. The ceremony was simple, held in front of the cabin with only a few neighbors as witnesses. Frances wore a blue dress she'd sewn from fabric purchased in Liberty Falls, and Preston donned the one good suit he'd kept from his pre-war life, somewhat tight across the shoulders now but serviceable. Charlotte, dressed in a white gown Frances had fashioned from one of her petticoats, was held by Mrs. Thornton, their nearest neighbor at 5 miles distant. The older woman had taken an immediate liking to Frances and appointed herself unofficial grandmother to Charlotte. As Preston and Frances exchanged vows, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, a backdrop more beautiful than any church could provide. Preston's voice was steady as he promised to love, honor, and protect Frances for all his days. Frances's hands trembled slightly in his, but her eyes were clear and certain as she made the same vows in return. "By the authority vested in me," the preacher pronounced, "I now declare you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Preston kissed his bride as their small audience applauded, Charlotte adding her own enthusiastic babbling to the celebration. For that perfect moment, the shadow of William Blackwood seemed very far away. The celebration afterward was modest but joyful, a feast of venison, fresh bread, and a cake Mrs. Thornton had insisted on baking. As night fell, lanterns were lit, and someone produced a fiddle, filling the air with music that had been absent from Preston's life for too long. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Hayes?" Preston asked formally, extending his hand to Frances. Her smile was radiant as she accepted. "You may, Mr. Hayes." They danced under the stars, Charlotte now sleeping peacefully inside the cabin. As Preston held his wife close, he marveled at how completely his life had changed in the span of a few short months. From solitary survivor to husband and father, from a man existing to a man truly living. "Happy," he murmured against Frances's hair. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, her cheek resting against his chest. "And you?" "I didn't know what happiness was until you knocked on my door," Preston admitted. "Now I can't imagine a day without you and Charlotte in it." As their guests departed and the night deepened around them, Preston and Frances stood on the porch of their cabin, arms around each other, looking out at the land that was now truly their home. "Mrs. Frances Hayes," Preston said, testing the name on his tongue. "Has a nice ring to it." "It does indeed," Frances agreed, leaning into his embrace. "Though I think Charlotte might still be getting used to it. She called me my yes earlier." Preston laughed. "She'll figure it out. She's a smart one, our daughter." "Our daughter." The words still sent a thrill through him each time he said them. "Come inside, husband," Frances said, taking his hand. "It's time to properly begin our life together." The summer passed in a blur of work and happiness. Preston and Frances fell into the rhythm of married life with surprising ease, as if they had been meant for each other all along. The cabin expanded first with a proper bedroom for Charlotte, then with a larger kitchen where Frances could indulge her love of cooking. Preston's cattle business thrived under his renewed dedication, and by August, they were discussing adding sheep to their growing operation. Charlotte flourished in the stable environment, growing from a baby into a toddler almost overnight, it seemed. Her vocabulary expanded daily, though paw remained her favorite word, shouted with enthusiasm whenever Preston returned from working the range. The threat of William Blackwood faded to the back of their minds as weeks passed with no sign of his men. They maintained vigilance. Preston never rode out without his rifle, and Frances kept the revolver close when he was away, but they refused to let fear dictate their happiness. In late September, as the first hints of autumn touched the cottonwoods along the creek with gold, Frances shared news that completed Preston's joy. "I'm with child," she told him one evening as they sat before the fire, Charlotte already asleep in her room. Due in spring, the same time as the calves. Preston stared at her in wonder, then gathered her into his arms with a whoop that threatened to wake their daughter. "A baby. Our baby." Francis laughed, pressing a finger to his lips. "Sure. You'll wake Charlotte, and then neither of us will get any sleep tonight." Preston kissed her soundly, then placed a gentle hand on her still, flat stomach. "How long have you known?" "I've suspected for a few weeks," Francis admitted. "But I wanted to be certain before I told you. Mrs. Thornton confirmed it when she visited yesterday." "Are you happy about it?"
Preston asked, suddenly concerned.
"After everything with Charlotte's birth." Francis covered his hand with her own. "This is entirely different. Charlotte was born in fear and uncertainty. This child will be born in love and safety, with a father who will be there from the first moment." The pride and responsibility of her words settled over Preston like a mantle. A father from the beginning, not just stepping into the role as he had with Charlotte, but present for every moment of this new life they had created together. "I love you," he said simply, the words still new enough to carry weight and wonder. "Both of you. All three of you," he corrected, including the tiny life just beginning. As they prepared for bed that night, Preston found himself watching Francis with new eyes, seeing not just the woman he loved, but the mother of his children, the keeper of his heart, the center of the life they were building together. The first snow fell in early November, earlier than usual for that part of Montana. Preston had just returned from Liberty Falls with supplies for the winter when the flakes began drifting down, large and lazy in the still air. "Charlotte, look," Francis called from the porch, holding their daughter up to see the spectacle. "Snow." Charlotte repeated happily, reaching out to catch the flakes. Preston laughed as he unloaded the wagon. "Close enough. She'll have plenty of time to learn the word properly. Weather like this, we might be snowbound until March." Francis didn't seem bothered by the prospect. "As long as we're together, I don't mind being snowbound." The evening was spent preparing for the winter ahead, checking stores, banking the fire, ensuring the livestock had adequate shelter. As darkness fell and the snow continued, Preston and Francis sat by the fire, Charlotte playing with wooden blocks on a blanket nearby. "I got something for you in town," Preston said, reaching into his coat pocket. "An early Christmas gift." He handed Francis a small package wrapped in brown paper. She unwrapped it carefully to reveal a silver locket on a delicate chain. "Preston, it's beautiful," she breathed, opening the locket to find it empty. "But it must have cost." "Don't worry about the cost," he interrupted gently. "You're carrying my child. The least I can do is give you something pretty to mark the occasion." He took the locket from her hands. "I thought we could put a lock of Charlotte's hair on one side and the new baby's when it comes on the other." Tears welled in Francis's eyes as she turned so Preston could fasten the chain around her neck. "It's perfect. Thank you." The locket gleamed in the firelight as Francis turned back to him, her expression softening as she leaned in for a kiss. A sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. Preston was on his feet instantly, hand moving to the revolver at his hip. Francis froze, then quickly gathered Charlotte into her arms, backing toward their bedroom. "Who would be out in this weather?" she whispered, fear evident in her voice. "Stay back," Preston ordered quietly, moving toward the door. He hadn't expected trouble, not with snow falling and night approaching, but years of frontier living had taught him caution. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Preston positioned himself to the side of the door, gun ready. "Who's there?" he called. "Delivery for Mrs. Francis Miller," a male voice replied. "From William Blackwood." Preston's blood ran cold. He glanced at Francis, seeing his own alarm reflected in her pale face. She clutched Charlotte tighter, backing further into the shadows of the room. "There's no one here by that name," Preston called back, cocking his revolver. "You've got the wrong house." A chuckle came from the other side of the door. "Now, we both know that's not true, Mr. Hayes." We've been watching this place for days. Saw the happy little family out greeting the snow earlier. Touching scene, really. Preston's mind raced. If they'd been watching for days, they knew the layout of the property, knew when he was away, knew about Francis and Charlotte's routines. What do you want? Preston demanded, though he already knew the answer. Just the girl, the voice replied. Mr. Blackwood is willing to be reasonable. He understands the mother has
moved on.
But the child is his blood, his heir. He wants what's rightfully his. Charlotte is my daughter, Preston growled, fury rising in him. My name is on her papers. She stays with her mother and me. That's unfortunate, the voice said, all pretense of friendliness gone. Because Mr. Blackwood isn't a man who takes no for an answer. And there are 4 of us out here, Mr. Hayes. Even a war hero like yourself can't stop all of us. Preston's mind worked rapidly, assessing options. The cabin was sturdy, but not built to withstand a determined attack. The nearest neighbors were miles away, unreachable in the falling snow. And Francis was in no condition to flee through the wilderness, even if there had been somewhere to go. Give me a minute to talk to my wife, Preston called, playing for time. Take your time, the voice replied, almost jovial now. We're not going anywhere. Snow's coming down pretty hard. Preston moved quickly to Francis, who stood white-faced by their bedroom door. The root cellar, he whispered. You and Charlotte.
Now.
I won't leave you to face them alone, Francis protested, though her arms tightened around their daughter. You have to, Preston insisted. For Charlotte. For our baby. He placed a hand briefly on her stomach. I'll handle this. There are 4 of them, Preston. And only one entrance to this cabin, he replied grimly. That evens the odds somewhat.
Go, Francis.
Please. The desperation in his voice must have convinced her, because Francis nodded reluctantly. Be careful, she whispered, pressing a quick kiss to his lips before hurrying to the pantry and the hidden trapdoor beneath. Once he was certain they were safely concealed, Preston returned to the door. I'm coming out, he called. Unarmed. Let's talk this through like reasonable men. He set his revolver on the table, but kept his hunting knife concealed at the small of his back. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door. 4 men stood on his porch, their horses visible at the hitching post through the falling snow. Preston recognized 2 of them as the men who had visited months earlier. The others were one an older man with cold eyes and a distinguished bearing despite his trail-worn clothes, the other a hulking figure whose face was partially hidden by a scarf. Mr. Hayes, the older man said, stepping forward.
I'm William Blackwood.
I believe you're harboring my fiancé and child. Preston assessed the man quickly wealthy, used to getting his way, but not a frontiersman. The real threats were the hired guns flanking him. Francis is my wife now, Preston said evenly. And Charlotte is my daughter in every way that matters. Blackwood's expression hardened. A technicality easily remedied. I have resources you can't imagine, Hayes. Judges who owe me favors, officials who can be bought. One way or another, I will have my child. Why? Preston demanded. You abandoned them both. Francis told me about your plans, how you meant to kill her after the baby was born. Something ugly flashed across Blackwood's face. Francis always did have an overactive imagination. I merely suggested she might be happier returning to her family after the child's birth. My family needs an heir, Hayes. The Blackwood line must continue. Find another woman to give you children, Preston suggested coldly. Francis and Charlotte are off limits. Blackwood sighed, as if dealing with a particularly stubborn child. I was hoping we could resolve this civilly. A financial arrangement, perhaps. You seem like a practical man. Surely there's a sum that would compensate you for your inconvenience. The implication that Preston's family could be bought infuriated him, but he kept his expression neutral. No amount of money would be enough. Everyone has a price, Blackwood insisted. Name yours. Preston studied the man before him, understanding now why Francis had fled in terror. Behind the veneer of civilization lurked something cold and calculating, a man who viewed people as possessions to be acquired or discarded at will. My price, Preston said slowly, is that you leave here tonight and never return. You forget about Francis and Charlotte. You accept that they have a new life that doesn't include you. Blackwood laughed, a sound without humor. I was told you were stubborn, but I didn't realize you were stupid as well. He gestured to the men behind him. Perhaps a demonstration of how serious I am will change your mind. Before Preston could react, the scarred man drew his pistol. But instead of aiming at Preston, he fired at the window of the cabin, shattering the glass and sending shards flying inward. Next one goes through your kneecap, Blackwood said conversationally. After that, we'll see how attached you really are to your family. Preston tensed, calculating the distance to the door, to his revolver on the table inside. He'd faced worse odds during the war, but never with so much at stake. Last chance, Hayes, Blackwood warned. Tell us where they are, or things get unpleasant. They're not here, Preston lied. I sent them to Liberty Falls yesterday, after we heard rumors you were in the territory. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. You're lying. The snow's been falling since morning, and there are no tracks leading away from this property. Preston realized his mistake too late. These men had indeed been watching the cabin closely, noting comings and goings. They knew Francis and Charlotte were inside. Enough talk, the scarred man growled, advancing with his gun leveled at Preston's chest. Let's search the place. What happened next unfolded in a blur of violence and instinct. As the men moved toward the door, Preston reached behind him and drew his hunting knife. In one fluid motion, he slashed at the scarred man's gun hand, opening a deep gash that sent the weapon clattering to the porch floor. The man howled in pain and staggered back, but his companions reacted quickly. The hulking figure lunged for Preston, while the shorter man from the previous visit drew his own weapon. Preston dove for the fallen pistol, rolling as a shot rang out, the bullet splintering the porch where he had been a moment before. He came up firing, catching the shorter man in the shoulder and sending him spinning backward into the snow. The hulking man was on him then, a mountain of muscle and fury that bore Preston to the ground. They grappled in the falling snow, breath coming in harsh gasps as they each fought for advantage. Preston managed to land a solid blow to the man's ribs, earning a grunt of pain, but took a punishing hit to the jaw in return that sent stars exploding across his vision. Through the haze, Preston was dimly aware of Blackwood shouting orders, of the scarred man recovering his wits and moving toward the cabin door. With a surge of desperate strength, Preston heaved the hulking man off him and staggered to his feet. "Francis," he shouted. "They're coming in." The warning was cut short as the hulking man tackled him again, this time from behind. Preston felt his forehead connect with the porch railing, warm blood instantly mixing with cold snow on his face. He fought to stay conscious, knowing that if he failed now, everything he loved would be lost. A gunshot rang out, startlingly loud in the snowy quiet. For a moment, Preston thought he'd been hit. Then the weight on his back suddenly lifted. He rolled over to see the hulking man clutching his thigh, blood seeping between his fingers. In the doorway of the cabin stood Francis, Preston's revolver steady in her hands, Charlotte balanced on her hip. Her face was a mask of determination as she leveled the gun at Blackwood. "Get off our property," she said, her voice clear and unwavering.
"Now."
Blackwood stared at her, momentarily speechless. Then his face contorted with rage. "You think you can threaten me? Do you have any idea who I am, what I can do to you?" "I know exactly who you are," Francis replied coldly. "A coward who would kill a woman for her inheritance." A man who sees his own child as nothing but a means to secure his family fortune. She cocked the revolver. And right now, you're a man with a gun pointed at his heart. Preston struggled to his feet, positioning himself beside Francis. Blood dripped from a cut above his eye, but his stance was firm as he faced down their attackers. Your men are wounded, he observed, nodding toward the 3 hired guns in various states of injury. You're outnumbered, Blackwood. And out here, there's no law that would question our right to defend our home. Blackwood looked from Preston to Francis, then to the child in her arms. For the first time, doubt crept into his expression as he seemed to realize the precariousness of his position. This isn't over, he said finally, backing toward his horse. You can't hide out here forever. Eventually, you'll have to venture into civilization, and when we do, Preston interrupted, it will be as a family. With legal papers that even your money can't overcome. Charlotte is my daughter now, legally adopted with witnesses and a judge's signature. It was a bluff. They had discussed adoption but hadn't yet completed the process. But Blackwood couldn't know that, and the momentary uncertainty that flashed across his face suggested the lie had struck home. You're lying, Blackwood said, but without conviction. Why don't you check with Judge Hamilton in Liberty Falls? Preston suggested, naming the circuit judge who had indeed been sympathetic to their situation. He was quite moved by Francis's story of your intentions. The implication was clear. If Blackwood pursued this further, his own unsavory plans might become public knowledge, damaging the very family reputation he claimed to protect. For a long moment, the tableau held Preston and Francis standing united in the doorway, Blackwood and his injured men facing them in the swirling snow. Then, with a curse, Blackwood gestured to his men. This isn't worth my time, he spat. The brat probably isn't even mine. Francis always was free with her favors. Preston felt Francis tense beside him at the slur, but her aim never wavered. Leave, William, she said quietly. And don't come back. Next time, I won't aim for the leg. Blackwood's face twisted with hatred, but he mounted his horse without further comment. His men followed suit, the scarred one helping the more seriously injured to their saddles. You haven't seen the last of me, Blackwood called as they prepared to ride away. A Blackwood never forgets an insult. And a Hayes never breaks a promise, Preston replied. If you ever threaten my family again, I'll kill you. The simple statement, delivered without heat but with absolute conviction, seemed to finally penetrate Blackwood's arrogance. With a last venomous glare, he wheeled his horse and rode into the falling snow, his men trailing behind him. Preston and Francis remained in the doorway until the riders disappeared from sight. Only then did Preston take the revolver gently from Francis's hand and pull her and Charlotte into his arms. Are you all right? He murmured against her hair. Both of you. Francis nodded, her composure finally cracking as she began to tremble. I heard the shot, saw you fall. I couldn't stay hidden. You saved my life, Preston said, leading her back inside and closing the door firmly. He barred it, then moved to cover the broken window with a spare blanket. That was some shooting, Mrs. Hayes. All those lessons paid off, Francis replied, setting Charlotte down on her blanket. The toddler, remarkably calm given the chaos, immediately began playing with her blocks as if nothing had happened. Preston winced as Francis examined the cut on his forehead. It needs stitching, she said, moving to heat water for cleaning the wound. As she tended to him, Preston watched Charlotte playing peacefully, seemingly unaffected by the violence that had erupted around her. He thought of the baby coming in spring, of the life they were building here, and felt a cold resolve settle in his chest. We need to make this official, he said as Francis tied off the last stitch. The adoption. Just in case Blackwood decides to pursue legal channels. Francis nodded, her hands gentle as she bandaged his forehead. We'll ride to Liberty Falls when the weather clears. Judge Hamilton has been kind to us. I think he'll help. And after that? Preston asked, catching her hand in his. Do we stay here, knowing Blackwood might return? Or do we consider alternatives? Frances was quiet for a moment, considering. This is our home, she said finally. We've put down roots here. I don't want to run again. To teach Charlotte that running is the answer to fear. Preston smiled, pride swelling in his chest at her courage. Then we stay. But we'll be prepared, just in case. We should send word to the marshal in Liberty Falls, Frances suggested. Report what happened here tonight. Create an official record. Preston nodded, impressed as always by her quick thinking. And I'll speak with our neighbors. Strength in numbers if it comes to that. They sat together by the fire, Charlotte eventually climbing into Preston's lap for a story before bed. As he read from her favorite book, Preston felt the tension of the evening gradually easing. They were safe for now, and they would take whatever steps necessary to ensure they remained so. Later, with Charlotte asleep and the cabin secured as best they could manage, Preston and Frances lay in their bed, holding each other in the darkness. I was so afraid, Frances whispered against his chest. Not of Blackwood, but of losing you, of Charlotte losing you. Preston tightened his arms around her. I'm not going anywhere. I promised you a family, a home, a future. I intend to keep that promise. Frances raised herself on one elbow to look down at him, her expression solemn in the dim light. I've never seen that side of you before. When you told William you would kill him if he threatened us again. You meant it. Yes, Preston admitted, not flinching from the truth. For you and Charlotte, for our baby coming in spring, there's nothing I wouldn't do. Instead of the fear or disapproval he half expected, Frances leaned down to kiss him with surprising intensity. Good, she whispered against his lips. Because there's nothing I wouldn't do for you either. In that moment, as snow continued to fall outside their window and the fire burned low in the grate, Preston understood that he had found something rarer and more precious than he had ever hoped for, not just love, but a partner who matched him in strength and determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Spring arrived in a rush of melting snow and new growth, transforming the landscape around the Hayes homestead. The winter had passed without further sign of William Blackwood or his men, though Preston and Frances remained vigilant. They had made the journey to Liberty Falls as soon as weather permitted, completing Charlotte's adoption and filing reports about the confrontation with Blackwood. The marshal had been sympathetic, promising to keep an eye out for trouble. As the land reawakened, so too did hope for the future. Frances's pregnancy progressed smoothly, her rounded belly a source of constant wonder to Preston. Charlotte, now walking confidently and chattering in increasingly complex sentences, often placed her small hands on her mother's stomach, delighted when she felt the baby move within. Baby coming soon? She would ask, her dark eyes serious. Very soon, Frances would reply, smoothing her daughter's hair. Then you'll be a big sister. Preston expanded their livestock operation, adding sheep as planned and hiring 2 hands to help with the increased workload. The ranch was prospering, allowing them to make improvements to the cabin and surrounding buildings. Life settled into a rhythm of productive days and peaceful nights, the shadow of Blackwood gradually receding from their thoughts. On a warm evening in early May, as Preston returned from checking the new lambs, he heard Charlotte's excited voice from the porch. Pa home, she called, running to meet him with outstretched arms. Preston swept her up, tossing her into the air and catching her as she squealed with delight. There's my girl. Have you been helping your mama today? Baby coming, Charlotte announced importantly. Mama said. Preston's heart stuttered in his chest. What?
Now.
Charlotte nodded vigorously as Preston carried her quickly toward the cabin. Mama in bed. Mrs. Tornan here. Sure enough, Preston found Mrs. Thornton heating water in the kitchen while Frances labored in their bedroom. The older woman looked up as he entered, her expression reassuring. "Everything's progressing normally," she said before he could ask. "First babies often take their time, but this one seems eager to join the world. Might be here before midnight." Preston nodded, trying to calm his racing heart. "Can I see her?" For a moment, Mrs. Thornton agreed. "Then you and Miss Charlotte should wait out here. I'll call you when there's news." Preston set Charlotte down with her blocks, then moved to the bedroom door. Frances lay on their bed, her face flushed with exertion but her eyes bright as she saw him. "You're home," she said, reaching out a hand to him. "Good timing." Preston crossed to take her hand, pressing a kiss to her damp forehead. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm doing the hardest work of my life," Frances admitted with a weak smile. "But Mrs. Thornton says everything is as it should be." A contraction seized her then, and Frances gripped Preston's hand with surprising strength, her breath coming in controlled pants as she worked through the pain. "You're the strongest person I know," Preston told her when it had passed. "You can do this." Frances nodded, her expression determined. "I know. Now go keep Charlotte occupied. She's been very concerned about why Mama is making strange noises." Preston laughed despite his worry. "Yes, madam." He pressed one more kiss to her lips. "I love you." "Love you too," Frances replied. "Now go, before Mrs. Thornton scolds us both." The hours that followed were among the longest of Preston's life. He distracted Charlotte with stories and games until she finally fell asleep on his lap, exhausted by the excitement. From the bedroom came the sounds of Frances's labor, her muffled cries during contractions, Mrs. Thornton's steady encouragement, the occasional splash of water as cloths were wrung out. Preston found himself praying, something he hadn't done with any regularity since the war. He prayed for Frances's strength, for the baby's safe arrival, for the family they were building to remain whole and protected. Just after midnight, as Preston dozed in his chair with Charlotte still asleep against his chest, the cry of a newborn pierced the quiet cabin. He startled awake, his heart pounding as the thin wail grew stronger. Mrs. Thornton appeared in the doorway, her face tired but beaming. "Congratulations, Mr. Hayes. You have a healthy son." Preston carefully transferred Charlotte to the sofa, covering her with a blanket before following Mrs. Thornton to the bedroom on unsteady legs. There he found Frances, exhausted but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in a clean white cloth. "Come meet your son," she said softly, pulling back the cloth to reveal a red-faced infant with a shock of dark hair. Preston approached the bed in awe, sinking down beside Frances to stare at the tiny person they had created together. "He's perfect," he whispered, reaching out to touch one miniature hand. The baby's fingers immediately curled around his, a grip surprising in its strength. "What shall we call him?" Frances asked, leaning against Preston's shoulder. "We never did decide." Preston studied his son's face, noting features that reminded him of both Frances and himself. "What about James? After my father?" Frances smiled. "James Hayes. It has a strong sound to it." "James Preston Hayes," Preston amended. "If that's all right with you?" Frances's eyes filled with tears of happiness. "It's perfect." Mrs. Thornton discreetly left them alone, going to check on Charlotte. In the quiet of their bedroom, Preston and Frances marveled at their son, counting fingers and toes, remarking on his strong lungs as he cried to be fed. "I never thought I could be this happy," Frances confessed as she nursed the baby for the first time. "When I ran from William, I was just trying to survive, to keep Charlotte safe. I never dreamed I'd find
this.
A real family. A man who loves us both." Preston's throat tightened with emotion. "When you knocked on my door that night, I thought you were just seeking shelter from the storm. I didn't realize you were bringing the storm to me, a whirlwind that would turn my whole life upside down in the best possible way." Frances laughed softly. "A storm?" Is that how you see us? The kind that clears the air, Preston clarified, stroking his son's downy head. The kind that washes everything clean and makes the world new again. They sat together in contented silence, watching as James drifted to sleep at his mother's breast. Eventually, Mrs. Thornton brought a sleepy Charlotte in to meet her brother, her small face a study in wonder as she peered at the baby. "My baby?" she asked, looking from Francis to Preston for confirmation. "Your brother," Preston corrected gently. "Your family." Charlotte seemed to consider this, then nodded with the gravity only a toddler could muster. "My family," she repeated, reaching out to touch James's cheek with careful fingers. Preston's heart swelled as he looked at the four of them together, the family that had found him when he wasn't looking, the love that had knocked on his door one stormy night and never left. As dawn broke over the Montana wilderness, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Preston stood on the porch of his cabin, James cradled in his arms. The newborn slept peacefully, unaware of the vastness of the world spread before him or the depth of love surrounding him. Inside, Francis and Charlotte slept too, exhausted by the night's events but safe and content. Preston looked out at his land, at the cattle and sheep grazing in the distance, at the mountains rising beyond, and felt a profound sense of rightness. This was what he had been searching for without knowing it, not just survival, but a life worth living. A woman who matched his strength and stubbornness with her own. Children who would grow up knowing they were wanted and protected. A home built with love and defended with fierce determination. "Welcome to the world, James Preston Hayes," he whispered to his sleeping son. "You've got quite a family waiting to meet you." The baby stirred slightly, his tiny face turning toward Preston's voice. In that moment, Preston made a silent promise to his son, to Charlotte, to Francis, and to himself that he would spend the rest of his days ensuring that the woman who had knocked on his door with a baby in her arms would never have reason to regret that he had let them in. And he would never, ever let them go.